evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to the Park Avenue Armory. Welcome to FLEXN. FLEXN, FLEXN, FLEXN. Get ready. One of the main reasons we love dance is that it's about action. And action is what's required in the United States right now and elsewhere. It's time to move things forward. What's very exciting is to be alive at a moment when a new form of dance is being invented in the history of dance, and it's coming from Brooklyn and East New York. And it's a generation of young people that has new things to say, which is why new vocabulary is called for. One of the most difficult things about the political situation in America is we have very tainted vocabulary to say things that need to be said, and we need new ways of expressing, new ways of articulating experiences, particularly of a young generation. What's very powerful is over here, Reg Rock Gray is one of the inventors of FLEXN, one of the granddaddies. He is, I think,
Granddaddy.
really ancient. I think like 32, I think. Is that right? Like,
that's right.
Oh my God, that's so sad. Okay, so just to say, when we started working on this piece, it was in August. It was 3 weeks after Eric Gardner was choked to death on Staten Island. Now, black men are shot by police all the time, and it doesn't stay a story. But that video, watching somebody die on the sidewalk while no one even bothered to look at him, you could tell something was different. 3 weeks later, that story would not go away. Our first rehearsals were in this room. And then in the second week of our rehearsals, Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson. And there were people in the streets all over this country. And you got the feeling that something might just change finally. And that people had had enough, and people were saying, wait a minute, we need to do this differently. And then, amazingly, we started to read about Rikers in the New York Times. And suddenly a culture of appalling violence and degradation of any kind of human dignity was being exposed on a regular basis, and the New York Times did not back off or back down. There have now been reports. It became an issue for the mayor. And suddenly New York and the world is involved with what happens at Rikers. And you think maybe we're at one of those moments when it's not just going to be incremental change over time, but it's time to make significant changes powerfully and clearly in these next months. Tonight we have some of the leaders of the movement and some of the people who have spoken out most courageously about the situation in Rikers and can speak from firsthand experience. Mary Buser is with us tonight. Thank you, Mary. Mary is one of the most courageous figures. She will have a book coming out soon. We will hear from you in just a moment. Sister Marion has been the chaplain at Rikers for 40 years. 23, sorry. I'm busy exaggerating Reggie's age, so. Again, testify directly and personally. And, of course, Ismael Nazario will speak to us directly from the experience and from to the future. And Jennifer Parish, who's been one of the most eloquent people in the whole movement. We're so thankful you're here tonight. Thank you very much. Mary, would you begin? What I would like everyone to start with is a moment that you experienced in your time at Rikers where you said, this must stop. There has to be change.
Well, thank you, Peter. There were quite a few moments that led up to the moment. I worked in the punitive segregation unit at Rikers Island, where I was assistant unit chief of mental health. For those of you who don't know, and you probably wouldn't, The punitive segregation unit is 500 cells set aside for isolation. Most of the inmates while I was there were on some type of psychotropic medication to try to help them endure the punishment, which in and of itself speaks to the grueling nature of solitary. But when those meds gave out and people could no longer hold on, they would threaten suicide, bang their heads, cut their arms, and we were called to a cell door. When we got there, we had to assess whether or not the situation warranted giving the person a temporary reprieve from the punishment. And because people threatened on a daily basis, this was not isolated, we could not let everyone out, so they would up the ante, and we would only let people out when we thought that death was likely. What started to happen for me is I was walking to cells that were blood-smeared, nooses, people cutting, banging, crying, begging for relief. And what was going through my head is, this is horrible, this is unbelievable, I'm in hell. And yet I live in a country that prohibits punishment that's cruel and unusual, so this cannot be as bad as it seems. And yet in my heart, I knew that this is horrendous and that we have gone way off course. And the second question I had to ask myself is how it was that a person like me, a social worker who went over to Rikers to make a difference, was now essentially a monitor of human suffering, and that I had become part of a system that I knew in my heart is so morally wrong, so cruel and unspeakable punishment. And when I came to that conclusion, and there were a lot of moments that led up to it, that for me spelt my departure from Rikers, that I could no longer participate in this punishment.
Sister Marion, would you say a word about your experience?
Yes. I was a chaplain on Rikers Island for 23 years, the years 1984 to 2007. My experience is a little different from Mary's in that I worked in the women's facility, the Rose M. Singer. And in the Rose M. Singer facility, there was a separate solitary confinement unit, which held 50 women as opposed to 500. And my task was to visit these women once a week and to do whatever I needed to be done, whatever I could do for the women. So I remember walking in, the first time I walked into the solitary confinement unit, I just looked around and I said to myself, this is absolutely barbaric. Keeping women in cells 23 hours and not allowing them to get in contact with their families on a regular basis. The women exhibited tremendous depression, and many times when I would go around from cell to cell, I would just see them just sleeping, lying in bed, just totally out of it. And the way the cell was the size of maybe an elevator, and there was a steel door, and there was a little window on the top, glass window, so you had to talk through the window, and then there was a slot where the food would be pushed in. And the women, after I would speak to them through this, it was difficult to do, but I would say, would you like me to pray with you? And they always said yes. And then they would put their hand on one side of the glass, and I would have my hand on the other. And that's how we prayed. I remember once asking a captain why this solitary confinement unit was called the Bing. We never referred to on Rikers, the solitary confinement was always referred to as the Bing. And I said, well, why the Bing? Where did that come from? And the captain said to me, well, you know, after a while, we realized that a person's mind, from being in solitary confinement, being in isolation, can suddenly go bing. So it meant that they were very aware of the fact that this was a terrible situation. But interestingly enough, I did whatever I could while I was there. I even tried to undermine the system in any way that I could. One way was that I was able to get a little cell and it set it up as an office in the unit, in the solitary confinement unit. And the officers would bring me a woman at a time, and I would have a phone in the office, my little cell, and they could make phone calls. I would give them stamps, envelopes. I would make calls from my office just to whatever way I could ease things. But I never really did anything more than that. It's interesting that I was also there at the time of the drug mules, and I got very involved in changing or repealing or reforming the Rockefeller drug laws, but I didn't think that there was anything I could do about this thing that I saw was so barbaric. And it was only after I left, after I retired, that I saw something online that was very interesting. It just stopped me in my tracks. It was a notice from the National Religious Campaign Against Torture stating that a person in solitary confinement for more than 15 days was being tortured. And that was from the United Nations report. And as soon as I saw that, I said, of course, it is torture. I never came to it myself, but yes, as soon as I saw the word torture with solitary confinement, I said, absolutely, they're so correct. And it was at that time that I realized that I had to get involved because of my experience. I had to get involved to do something to ban the use of solitary confinement. And my colleague, Jennifer Parish, has been doing a magnificent job in this area. So maybe you could
Jennifer,
continue.
take it.
Sure. So I'm an attorney. I work at the Urban Justice Center Mental Health Project, and a lot of our work is focused on making sure that people who are getting mental health treatment in the jails get connected to services when they go home. And so I'm frequently talking to people about that. And as part of that work, we were going into the jails, and I had the I don't want to call it an opportunity, but I got to see exactly what it looks like, these solitary confinement units. And one of the things, solitary confinement is horrible across the board, but at Rikers Island, most of the people there are awaiting trial. So they've been charged with something, but they're innocent until proven guilty. There hasn't been any proof demonstrated to the court that they actually did what they've been accused of. So even in those circumstances, they were being held in solitary confinement. And one of the closest, the things that, it's all very heartbreaking, but there's a woman that I've been advocating for who's been incarcerated since February 2012, and she's been in solitary since April of that year. She recently got released as a result of the changes that have happened in January, but she spent, 2.5 years in solitary confinement, and even for me to be able to go and visit her, I had to deal with the lawyers from Department of Corrections, because they would say, oh, she's refusing to come down. They would say she refuses to go to court. And she wasn't really refusing, but the correction officers there didn't like her. They didn't like her because of what she was accused of. And so she'd been placed in solitary, and once she was in solitary, she got another infraction. I got copies of her infractions, and some of them were for cutting her wrist, and they would tell her to stop cutting her wrist, and when she didn't, they would spray her with their spray that they used and stop her, but then afterward they would give her a ticket for disobeying a direct order, and they would give her more time in solitary. And I don't know what that is besides torture, so that's why I continue to fight, and am part of a group called the Jails Action Coalition and the Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement.
Thank you so much. Ismael, would you speak to us from the inside and a moment that moves you forward?
Sure. So Currently, I work at the Fortune Society, and my department, we work with people that are at high risk of recidivism. New York City, the recidivism rate is incredibly high. So what we do is discharge plan on Rikers Island to set them up with some type of discharge plan prior to their release. So once they are released into the community, we actually set them up with proper services so they can make a positive transition back into the community. Another thing though that, stands out in New York City is, well, New York State as a whole. New York State is one of only 2 in the whole US that arrest and prosecute 16 to 17-year-olds as adults. So just take that into consideration. 16 and 17-year-old, in the eyes of adults, they're children. So they're being arrested and accused of a crime, but yet they're being tried as an adult and facing time in an adult jail and prison. So with all of these things that exist right now, I feel that reform needs to happen and major changes need to take place is because at one point in time in my life, I was 16 and 17 years old. And unfortunately, when I was 16 and 17 years of age, I was actually one of those young people that was housed and detained on Rikers Island. Before I turned 18, I spent 400 days on Rikers Island. And what makes it even worse, and it's sad to report, before I turned 18, I spent 300 days in solitary confinement. So I know I have the first-hand experience, and I know exactly what it looks like, what it feels like, and what it is to be inside, and I mean on the inside, not as a civilian, but as a detainee awaiting trial. So something that I noticed at my young age while on Rikers, so many of the young people that I was incarcerated with, it was just like a huge revolving door. I saw so many young people coming in and out, back and forth, and I'm still here sitting, waiting for a disposition to be reached on my case. But yet, these young people had the opportunity, some of them had the opportunity to go back home, be with their family, friends, whoever they have out in society, but yet 2 weeks later, they're coming right back in. So once I started to notice that, it just started to dawn upon me, something really needs to happen from this time, especially with our young people. And to make matters worse, while young people are there, they're subject to so much violence because there's a culture of violence that exists on Rikers Island that's been in existence for who knows how many years. And young people pretty much get the worst end of it because they're subject to a majority of this violence from the correctional officers. Because, once again, mind you, we're talking about 16 to 17-year-olds, kids, being brutally attacked by correctional officers because they're out of place at the moment, or this young person doesn't agree with what the correctional officer just told them to do. So from my experience, from being inside, and then, as I started to mature and started to see things more and started looking through life through a different scope, I just felt that I think I really need to get involved. And then I had a lot of older individuals that surrounded me that told me that I have something different. At the time, I really didn't take it into consideration because I didn't know what they saw. I always heard that I was just a little bit more mature for my age than normal, and I just carried myself differently. So a lot of the jewels that was dropped on me, I guess, stuck with me. And once I was released and I tried to do things with my life in society, people out here was telling me the same thing, but now it's different types of people. Some similar experiences, some not. And they're telling me they see something different and I have a story to tell. So I figured, why not use it to make some type of change? But then aside from that, with the work that I do, now I'm also seeing it from the other side. So there's a lot that really needs to take place. And moving forward, to get to the end of the question, if we really want change to happen, we need to look back just a little bit at what didn't work so we could tweak it and make it work and make it better. But of course, everything takes money, right? But yet, a lot of the money is being used and wasted by keeping people on Rikers Island in the first place. So how come that same money that's used to keep these people housed and detained there not be put for good use, for better use, for people to actually be rehabilitated and get therapeutic services while they're incarcerated, detained.
Thank you. Could I just continue with next steps? Mary.
Well, there have been some wonderful, as we've been discussing here, with the New York Times articles, with the Jail Actions Committee. There seems to be in the whole, not only in New York City, but I think in the country, a growing awareness around mass incarceration and the utter failure of the drug laws, of the ways in which these laws have not only punished perpetrators, usually for nonviolent crimes, many of them mentally ill, but also children, families, that it's been an utter devastation for communities and families. So many of these laws are so overreactive. That was one of the big things that I discovered at Rikers, that the people who were behind bars are not the heinous demons that splash up in the New York Post. They are the hapless, the mentally ill, the down and out, the lost, the people with some supervision and perhaps drug treatment would never have wound up there in the first place. And I think we're seeing a growing realization of this, and I think there's a groundswell starting for some big changes.
Sister Marion.
Yes, I remember I was on vacation in last August, and I picked up the New York Times, and I saw on the front page this expose about Rikers. I absolutely could not believe it. What I could not believe was not what they were saying, because I knew that every single thing they were saying was absolutely true. I could not believe it was on the front page of the New York Times. I mean, that just absolutely blew me away. And then the second day, it was Rikers Island again, front page, New York Times. And I'm thrilled that the Times has not let up on this issue. You know, every few days, every few weeks, an editorial, an op-ed piece. And they're really hammering away at it. And people are beginning to, the consciousness is being raised. And I'm thrilled with that. And I would just like to say that when you came into the lobby, I hope that you saw some material on the desk at the front page. There's also a petition that can be signed, and the petition is going to Governor Cuomo, saying that we demand that changes be made, that solitary confinement ceases, that we will be more in line with the civilized countries of the world. We're probably we are exceptional in that we're the worst when in terms of the way we're dealing with our inmates and how they're being treated. And so I would ask you, please, before you leave, get to that table, take the material home. There's some very, very good material there, and sign the petition that solitary confinement must end.
Sure. I think we certainly, and I wholeheartedly support your signing our petition. You're joining the Jails Action Coalition. You're coming to Board of Correction meetings that are open to the public where you can talk about your concerns about the jails. But I think all of us need to be committed to seeing everyone as a person. Every single person who's in jail is a human being. And unfortunately, we've dehumanize people in that process. The people who work in the jails often refer to the people who are incarcerated there as bodies. And if they say inmates, they think that they're moving up. We can't see people as bodies. We have to see them as human beings and fellow New Yorkers, and we have to expect that they will be treated with fairness and dignity, and that their humanity will be respected. I think we have lots of issues in this country around race, and I think that that's allowed us to make some of the horrible choices we've made about the criminal justice system and what we think is acceptable for the way we treat people, and I hope we can all be part of changing that.
Systematic dehumanization dehumanizes the dehumanizers. We also have to say that the entire society is stained. And this is why the humanities are here, which is to actually revalue and understand more deeply human beings, and to actually place humanity back into situations that have been dehumanized. To rescue these topics from conservative or liberal and say, no, they're human. And the solutions to many of them, your mother could have told you. And could we really move now in an atmosphere of how you would want anyone treated? And can we begin to recognize crime as a much larger situation that has many, 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 many causes? The reason we have the arts is because, in general, most people in Hollywood movies are looking at effects, special effects. And of course, what we need to look at are causes. What creates something? And the solutions in front of us for these very complicated programs which have gone so far off course, the solutions have to be creative solutions. And that is why we need creative space devoted to these questions. What I'm happy to say tonight is you will have 21 very creative young people from Brooklyn who have poured themselves and their bodies into these questions and will emerge with brilliantly virtuosic human insights, solutions, and joy in the face of something that has so much despair. Over to the dancers.
Let's take you home.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to our panel. Let's move forward. Please sign the petition. Have a great night.
Thank
Welcome
you.
to FLEXN.
All right.